Tonight we slip into the soot-streaked shadows of an old, flickering hearth. The flames are low, the night is long, and a girl in worn clothes curls beside the ashes, the cinders smudging her cheeks, like war paint from a different kind of battle. This is not the cleaned-up Cinderella, you know, the one where mice sing and pumpkins turn polite. No, this is the original tale, the darker one, where grief clings like smoke, and justice doesn't always wait for midnight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. The story begins with a death. Not loud or sudden, just the kind that hollows a house. Cinderella's mother was kind and beautiful, the sort of person whose presence felt like springtime, even in November. When illness took her, it didn't just steal warmth from her daughter's life, it shattered everything. Before she died, her mother had whispered to her, "Dear child, remain pious and good, and I will look down from heaven and be with you." Cinderella believed her. She had to. Her father, meanwhile, moved through grief the way some men do, by distraction. Within a year he brought home a new wife, one with 2 daughters who had pearls on their shoes and venom in their smiles. People still argue whether the father was ignorant or just cowardly. He certainly wasn't protective. The new stepmother saw Cinderella's quiet sadness and mistook it for weakness. The girls, Cinderella's stepsisters, saw her as a threat. Not because she had anything they lacked materially, but because even in her patched dress, Cinderella had something they couldn't fake: grace. That's dangerous stuff. They stripped her of her room and her dresses and shoved her into the kitchen. Her bed became the ashes by the fireplace, and the nickname, Cinderella, wasn't affection. It was mockery. Each day she scrubbed pots, carried water, and wore soot like a second skin. At night, she would creep out into the garden, whisper to the sky, and cry at the grave of her mother, which sat beneath a hazel tree she'd planted herself. That tree grew fast, unnaturally fast, some would say. Within days it sprouted, and within weeks its branches tangled high, full of life, even in winter. Now this part's important. Every time Cinderella wept at her mother's grave, the birds gathered in the branches. White doves, soft and glowing in the moonlight, would coo gently, fluttering around her, as though they understood grief better than anyone. Some people believe this is symbolic, a metaphor for resilience and hope. Others argue whether magic actually infused the tree, placed there by the dying mother's love. It's one of those folkloric shrug moments. Anyway, life in the household was less Blended Family the musical and more Survival Domestic Edition. The stepmother hated anything she couldn't control, and Cinderella's quiet beauty became unbearable. She was given the worst chores and served the last scraps of food. Her stepsisters learned early that cruelty is a bonding activity. They mocked her cinder-stained face, called her names, and tried on every cruel giggle like it was a new shade of lipstick. Still, she endured. Because here's the secret about Cinderella. She wasn't passive. That's a modern misunderstanding. She watched, she remembered. And every time she swept the floor or lit the fire, she told herself that one day the ashes would become embers, and embers, if you're patient, become flames. And wouldn't you know it, something began to shift, not in the house, but in the kingdom. Trumpets sounded, decrees were issued, whispers scurried from village to village. The king was throwing a grand ball, not just any ball, a multi-night celebration so the prince could choose a bride, because nothing says royal matchmaking like a dance marathon. The stepsisters immediately lost their minds. Suddenly they needed everything: shoes, jewels, lace, fans, lessons in posture and flirtation. Cinderella watched them fumble with corsets and try out fake laughs in front of mirrors. It was honestly entertaining. One even attempted to bleach her teeth using charcoal and vinegar. Spoiler, don't. They refused to let Cinderella go, of course. Her stepmother told her, "You have no dress, no shoes, and you're too dirty to be seen." That's parenting, 17th century style. But Cinderella didn't cry. Not this time. She simply nodded, swept the floor, and that night she walked back to the hazel tree. The moon was a sliver. The wind whispered like an old friend. She knelt, pressed her forehead to the roots, and whispered, "Mother, shake the tree for me. Let something fall, so I may see the ball." The birds rustled, a shimmer passed through the branches, and something did fall. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The point is, beneath the dirt, beneath the soot, beneath the years of silent endurance, something had begun to glow inside Cinderella. A kind of magic that wasn't taught or given, but earned. And just like the embers she curled beside every night, it was ready to rise. The night air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, and Cinderella's fingers tingled against the rough bark of that curious hazel tree. Its branches swayed without wind, whispering the secrets of a world she'd nearly forgotten. The feel of her mother's hand on her cheek, the soft hum of lullabies at dusk. Hazels really do grow wild in these parts. Their nuts a common woodland snack for both humans and rodents. Nature's way of saying, yes, squirrels are real food thieves. Mainstream fact. She knelt before the tree, its roots knotted like a sleeping giant's fingers, pressing her palm into the soil. "Mother," she breathed, "I know you're here." People still argue whether the magic in this tale was born from a grief or divine intervention, but Cinderella didn't need a scholarly consensus. She needed hope. A single white dove fluttered down, rustling her hair, and dropped a slender branch heavy with silvery leaves. Cinderella tasted the metal tang of moonlight on her tongue, a reminder that miracles often arrived wrapped in the simplest packages. She plucked the branch, tracing its veins like a secret map, and felt the warmth of her mother's presence. Somewhere in those asters of silver was a spark she could use. Back in the kitchen, the ash heap tugged at her skirt, as if scandalized by her very presence. The rats, bold as bankers, scurried away, perhaps out of respect, or maybe they'd just seen too much. She gathered the branch and whispered, "Help me." That night, Cinderella worked by candle glow, crafting her wish. She cut and shaped the branch into a bodice frame, twisting twigs into straps. Her breath was steady, rhythmic, like the pulse of someone who had done this before, in dreams. Each snap of a twig echoed through the silent house, reminding her that creation and destruction live side by side. By dawn, she had woven a rough corset of silky bark and budding catkins. The scent of sap and fresh wood filled the room, mingling with the faint aroma of burnt stew from the previous evening. She slipped the makeshift bodice over her patched shift and felt the branch pulse warmly against her skin, as though it recognized her need. Outside, the pigeons cooed their morning complaints, the sun's rays tipping the world in gold. Cinderella perched on a stump and watched the step-parents' cottage shudder into wakefulness. Her step-sisters emerged in their fine gowns, one in emerald, one in ruby, parading like two peacocks who'd never known hunger. Cinderella smirked. If beauty contests were judged by grace under pressure, she'd have a crown already. As the household bustling began, she tucked the branch beneath her skirt and slipped away. Each footstep was a promise, to herself, to her mother's memory, that she would not remain ash-bound. She found her way back to the hazel tree, whose trunk looked ancient now, lined with silver scars. Cinderella pressed the bodice frame into the bark, humming a lullaby her mother had sung. The melody rose and fell, a gentle tide that carried her yearning upward. Then, with a soft exhale, she wished for one night, just one night, to stand before the prince, to be seen as more than cinders and silence. The tree trembled, veins of pale light rippling through its bark. Leaves rustled in applause. A hollow sound emerged, like 1,000 bells tolling softly in the earth. From the base of the tree, a small door swung open, revealing a staircase carved from roots and moonbeams. Cinderella's heart fluttered. It was exactly what you'd expect when a hidden staircase appears, but she didn't hesitate. Up she climbed, each step cushioned by moss and lit by drifting motes of light. The world beyond the tree's canopy revealed itself in fragments, fields shimmering with dew, a palace roof glowing in dawn's early light, and ribbons of smoke curling from distant chimneys. It felt like stepping into a dream you half remember, both familiar and utterly new. At the top she found herself in a clearing ringed by stones. In the centre lay her dress, a gown spun from moonlight and spider's silk, the colour of pale lavender. Under it sat slippers of dew-dropped crystal, fragile as hope itself. Cinderella's breath caught. The magical branch, her mother's gift, had transformed her labour into something wondrous. She let the gown slide over her head. It felt cool, soft, alive. Each fold whispered against her skin, and every stitch hummed a lullaby. The slippers nestled onto her feet like second skins. She turned to the hazel tree with gratitude, and it bowed its branches as if in deep respect. Stepping back down, Cinderella tucked the empty branch into her pocket. Later, if anyone asked, she'd say it was a trick of light, a child's fantasy, or perhaps divine grace. People still argue whether fairy tales were created to comfort children or to warn them about in-laws. Either way, she felt ready. Time ticked toward the ball, and the world brimmed with possibility. From soot to silk, from grief to grace, Cinderella had embraced hope, woven it with her own hands, nourished it at her mother's grave, and set it free beneath a hazel tree. The town buzzed like a beehive at dusk. Every street echoed with clattering hooves, rustling fabrics, and the gasping squeals of daughters trying not to ruin their curls. Royal messengers had made their rounds days ago, pinning parchment invitations to gates and tavern doors. The prince would host not one, but 3 grand balls, each more lavish than the last, and by the final night he would choose a bride. Cinderella's stepsisters treated the announcement like an Olympic event. They practiced curtsies until their knees cracked, argued over which shade of ribbon best said eligible, and practiced smizing in the cracked hallway mirror. One of them tried on 17 pairs of gloves in a single hour, which may be a record. Their mother, meanwhile, was consumed with logistics. She wasn't just aiming for her daughters to attend, she was determined one of them would win. The ball to her wasn't romance, it was strategy. A social chessboard where appearances, not pawns, determined outcomes. And so, Cinderella was tasked with everything. She ironed dresses until her fingers blistered, polished shoes until they gleamed like lake water, and fetched combs, powders, and, yes, even whalebone stays, corsets so uncomfortable they make modern shapewear look like pyjamas. She did it all silently, not because she lacked a voice, but because the house only ever seemed to listen when she was quiet. As the first evening approached, the manor was a symphony of chaos, perfume clouds heavy enough to knock out a goat, the clatter of hairpins bouncing off tile, and one particularly intense incident involving a rogue feather boa and a hairbrush. Cinderella kept her head down, biting the inside of her cheek to stay grounded. She had her own plan. "Make sure we look perfect," the stepmother hissed. "Our name's riding on this." Cinderella adjusted a hem without comment. Her fingers trembled slightly, not with fear, but anticipation, because under her apron, tucked away in a fold of burlap, was the shimmer of something sacred. The slippers. The gown remained hidden beneath loose floorboards near the hearth, kept safe beneath a sheet of linen and a prayer. As the carriage pulled away, stuffed with silk, rouge, and ambition, Cinderella was finally alone. She let out a slow breath, one she hadn't realised she'd been holding. The air was quiet again. Night had begun to press itself against the windows, full of stars and unanswered wishes. She moved quickly now, like a girl stepping back into her skin. First to the hazel tree, always the first. She pressed a hand to the trunk, whispered her thanks, and asked for strength. The tree rustled, a sound that could have been wind or approval. Then to the floorboards. The linen pulled back easily. The dress waited for her like an old friend, catching candlelight and drinking it in. She changed with reverence, The fabric kissed her skin. The sleeves floated like cloud lace. Her hair, once matted from ash, now curled into soft waves as she brushed it gently. She looked not like someone else, but like the truest version of herself. The slippers were last, cool, delicate, impossible. Just as she fastened the second, a low knock echoed through the door. Cinderella froze. Another knock. Then the door creaked open on its own. Outside stood a carriage, unlike anything she'd ever seen. It wasn't golden, it wasn't grand. It was subtle, wood veined with ivy, wheels of worn silver, and a single dove perched on the driver's shoulder. The reins led to 4 deer, yes, deer, standing patiently, as though this was all perfectly reasonable. Cinderella stepped forward. The dove tilted its head, then gave a soft coo as if to say, well, coming or not. She didn't hesitate. The step up was smooth, and the inside smelled faintly of pine and apples. The door closed behind her, and in a blink the carriage rolled forward, wheels humming a lullaby. People still argue whether the carriage was summoned by the tree, or if it belonged to something older, wilder. Some claim forest spirits sent it. Others say her mother's soul rode shotgun. Either way, Cinderella wasn't afraid. She felt known. The journey was short. The road wound through moonlit meadows and lantern-strung towns, then curved toward the palace gates, like a stream toward the sea. The palace itself was, well, let's be honest, utterly extra. Tall marble towers stabbed the sky like crystal daggers, fountains sang in 4 languages, and every guard looked like he'd walked out of a romance novel. Inside, the ballroom glowed with candlelight and music. Laughter shimmered from every corner. The second she stepped in, the room changed. The music didn't stop. No one gasped, but a ripple passed through the air, soft and electric. Heads turned. Some curious, others jealous, but all entranced. And the prince, he stared like he'd never seen colour before. Now, important to note, this prince wasn't a caricature. He wasn't clueless or cocky. He was young, curious, and utterly bored of empty conversations and overly powdered faces. He'd been enduring these balls like dentist appointments, nodding politely, and dreaming of running off with a lute and a decent pair of boots. But when he saw Cinderella, something clicked. Not fireworks, not fate, just interest. He approached, bowed, asked for her hand. And she smiled. Not coy, not dramatic. Just a real, honest smile that made him forget his name for about 3 seconds. They danced. 1, 2, then 3 songs. The music pulsed through her like memory. The prince asked where she lived. She laughed. Far from here was all she said, but the clock was moving, and Cinderella knew, oh, she knew, magic has limits. So just before midnight, as the strings swelled and the chandeliers sparkled, she stepped away. The prince called after her, but she didn't look back. She ran, not like someone afraid, but someone who understood the stakes. Out the door, down the steps, into the carriage, and just like that, gone. No slipper left behind. Not yet. Just mystery, and maybe a little triumph. The palace couldn't stop talking. By morning, rumours had already begun to snowball. The mysterious maiden, her vanishing act, the prince's dazed expression. The way she danced like music had been written just for her. Every noble in the city had a theory. Some said she was a royal from another land. Others insisted she was a ghost, come to tempt the prince away from worldly concerns. A few swore they saw her float. People still argue whether the palace guards were lying when they said she disappeared on foot. No carriage, no escort, just the whisper of silk trailing behind her like fog. Cinderella, meanwhile, was back at home, half buried in laundry and secrets. Her stepsisters were already picking apart the night, each claiming the prince had definitely looked at her longer. They dissected every moment, what she wore, how her voice sounded, if she had freckles or fey blood. Cinderella just listened, quietly smiling into the soapsuds. That night, the second invitation was sent, this time gilded at the edges. A continuation of the royal celebration, it read. All eligible maidens encouraged to attend. Encouraged, as if the kingdom wasn't already in a state of hair-pulling panic. Every seamstress was booked solid. One tailor had a nervous breakdown over 16 emergency bustle requests. The stepsisters were ecstatic. The stepmother was worse. She micromanaged their wardrobes with military precision, comparing gowns, redoing hair arrangements, even going so far as to pinch their cheeks herself for that perfect pink glow. Meanwhile, Cinderella scrubbed the floors until her knuckles cracked, but her mind was elsewhere. The tree, the dress, the prince, and beneath it all something she didn't dare name: possibility. When the family left again, swept away in their own noise, Cinderella ran to the hazel tree. This time she didn't even speak. She just knelt, and the birds already knew. From the branches floated a dress the colour of starlight, blue threaded with silver, delicate as frost, but sharp as clarity. It made the first gown look like a sketch. The golden slippers were back too, freshly cleaned, thanks birds, gleaming faintly under the tree's roots. She dressed quickly. There was less hesitation now, less wonder. She didn't question the magic anymore, not because she took it for granted, but because it felt earned. The hush of the night folded around her like a cloak. The deer-drawn carriage was waiting again, this time with two doves resting on the reins. One tilted its head and blinked at her like, "Round two?" The ride was faster this time, or maybe she just felt more ready. At the palace, things were different. She didn't just arrive, she entered. Heads turned, jaws dropped. Even the musicians missed a note. The prince was on the staircase, mid-conversation, and nearly fell down 3 steps trying to get to her. "Thank you for returning," he said, breathless. Cinderella only smiled. "You asked nicely." They danced again, and again, and again. No small talk, no awkward pleasantries, just motion and breath and the quiet bond that forms when two people stop performing and start simply being. The court watched in stunned silence. One duke whispered, "She must be a sorceress." A countess muttered, "Or a spy." But the prince only saw her. When he offered to bring her water, she declined. "I prefer to keep moving," she said. "You dance like you're trying to outrun something." "Maybe I am." He liked her even more for that. But the night ticked forward, and Cinderella felt the familiar tug behind her ribs. That pull toward the exit. Magic doesn't scream. It tugs. She excused herself softly. He tried to follow, but the crowd blocked him just long enough. She slipped through the marble corridor, out the door, down the grand staircase. And again, no shoe lost. Not yet. She ran all the way to the edge of the woods, kicked off the slippers, stuffed them into her apron, and vanished into the trees. No carriage this time, just feet and memory guiding her home. Back at the fireplace, she scrubbed her cheeks, mussed her hair, and curled back into the ashes just as the front door creaked. The stepsisters barreled in, screeching over each other. She was there again, even more beautiful. The prince didn't dance with anyone else. He was enchanted, Cinderella yawned and asked, "What did she wear?" "Like you'd know anything about fashion," one snapped. "I imagine it was pale blue," Cinderella murmured. "Like ice in moonlight." The stepmother narrowed her eyes. The next morning, another invitation arrived. One final night, one last dance, one decision. And the prince, he was done playing nice. This time he planned a trap. Sticky pitch on the marble stairs. Guards posted at every exit. He wouldn't ask her name, he would catch her. Which, yes, is a little alarming when you say it out loud. But back in the manor, Cinderella had her own strategy. When her family left, she ran to the hazel tree one last time. The final dress was gold, not pale gold, not polite shimmer. It blazed like fire, like autumn leaves, and lion's manes, and defiance. The sleeves were sheer. The bodice fit like armour. The slippers, still gold, reflected the dusk like twin mirrors. She didn't pause to marvel. She was already moving. This wasn't just a ball anymore. This was her moment, to be seen, to choose, and to test the prince. The final night crackled with energy before the first candle was lit. The palace, as if sensing its own importance, glowed brighter than ever. Windows flooded with golden light, towers laced with velvet banners, and every chandelier polished to the point of vanity. Servants moved like shadows, gliding from room to room, adjusting details no one would notice, but everyone would somehow feel. The prince stood near the staircase, not just hopeful this time, but ready. He had barely slept. Not from love, not yet, from curiosity, from the gnawing ache of not knowing who she was, or where she went, or why she kept slipping through his fingers like dreams at sunrise. And more than anything, from the fear that she might not come back. But come back she did. Cinderella stepped into the ballroom like it was her birthright. The dress of firelight flickered with every movement, catching every eye. Even the musicians fumbled their tempo when they saw her. She walked not with arrogance, but with such pure presence that people moved aside instinctively, as if gravity had just changed direction. The prince saw her, everything else blurred. "You came," he breathed, moving toward her as if pulled on a string. "I said I would," she said, and her voice was soft but clear, like a bell, like a dare. They danced, and not the formal court kind, not the gliding, polite, "How's your uncle's vineyard?" sort. This was something older, something visceral. Every step was a conversation, every spin a challenge. The ballroom disappeared, then returned, as if the entire palace had paused to let them have this moment uninterrupted. And the prince, who had spent most of his life being told who to be, how to speak, what to love, realized he felt free for the first time in years. They didn't speak for long stretches, but when they did, it was like pulling ribbon from silk. "I still don't know your name," he said quietly. "Does it matter?" she asked. "Yes, then you'll have to earn it." People still argue whether Cinderella meant to challenge him, or if she was simply terrified. Because when you've been invisible your whole life, being seen feels like standing in front of a bonfire. Beautiful, but scorching. The music slowed, midnight loomed, and Cinderella felt it. The tug, again, sharper this time. She glanced at the windows. The moon, once high, now skimmed the trees. The moment was ending. She hesitated, just long enough. Then run! She turned and dashed through the parting crowd, past startled nobles and bewildered guards. The prince cursed softly and followed. She was faster than she looked. Years of sprinting between errands had made her limbs into instruments of flight. Down the staircase she flew, and that's when it happened. The pitch thick, sticky, black as sleep. She hit it mid-step, and the slipper, her right one, snagged. It didn't rip or fall off. It stuck, as if the palace itself had grabbed her. Cinderella yanked her foot free, nearly stumbling, and kept going. One shoe on, one behind. She didn't look back. The prince reached the bottom seconds too late. He knelt, breathless, and picked up the golden slipper. It still glowed faintly in his palm. It was her, he whispered. Behind him murmurs rippled, courtiers leaning in, the stepmother and stepsisters, arriving late, shoved to the front, craning their necks. "She left the slipper," someone whispered. "He's going to find her." By morning the declaration was official. The prince would marry the woman whose foot fit the golden slipper. No substitutes, no exceptions. Cue chaos. Every eligible girl in the kingdom was suddenly very interested in shoe size. Cobbler shops were overrun. One girl tried to stretch her toes with river stones. Another locked herself in a steam room for 6 hours. The desperation was, well, creative, but the slipper was small, incredibly small, and enchanted, which meant no tricks. The search began, town by town, door by door. Cinderella's village was low on the list. After all, she wasn't supposed to exist. But when the royal procession arrived, guards, trumpets, heralds, the manor stirred with greed. "They're here," cried one stepsister, nearly knocking over a candlestick. "Quick, get the foot bath." "Where's the lavender oil, Sabat?" Cinderella stood by the fireplace, one hand over her apron pocket. Inside, the second slipper, warm, waiting. The prince didn't travel himself. He had others do the checking. Practical? Maybe. Cowardly? Possibly. But he wanted to believe that when it mattered, he'd know. At the manor, the steward bowed and presented the shoe like it was made of sun. The first stepsister tried, tugged, grunted. "It fits! Your heel is bleeding," the steward said. The second stepsister took her shot. Shoved, twisted, even bit her lip dramatically. Still no. The stepmother smiled too hard. "That's all, good sir. No one else lives here." Then Cinderella stepped forward, from the shadows. Hair soot-touched, apron frayed, but with eyes that didn't flinch. "I'd like to try," she said. The stepmother laughed. "You? Don't waste their time." The steward raised a brow. "All maidens, my lady." Cinderella sat, calm, quiet, and slid her foot in. The shoe didn't just fit, it welcomed her, like it remembered her, like it had been made for no one else. Gasps, shouts. The doves, yes, they were still watching, burst from the rafters and spun in a circle above her head. And then, from her apron, she drew the second slipper. Silence. The stepmother's mouth opened, closed. The stepsisters went pale, then red, then pale again. One fainted. The steward looked stunned. And Cinderella, she smiled. Not smugly, not with vengeance, just a quiet, clean smile, like someone who had finally exhaled after years of holding her breath. The prince didn't hear about the slipper fitting from a formal report. He heard it from a bird, literally. The palace had no shortage of oddities, singing fountains, talking portraits, a library that sometimes rearranged itself. But the sudden arrival of 2 white doves in the throne room still raised some noble eyebrows. One landed on the arm of his chair, the other dropped something into his lap, a single ash-grey thread from an apron. Then both birds cooed in unison and vanished out the nearest window. He stood. No shoes, no escort, just go. Outside, he didn't wait for the usual preparations. He simply leapt onto the nearest horse. Poor stable boy nearly fainted, and galloped for the manor like his heart had launched itself forward, and his body was playing catch-up. At the manor, the mood was complicated. Cinderella stood beside the steward, slipper on one foot, the second still in hand. Her stepmother had retreated into tight-lipped silence, the kind that precedes either apology or disaster. One stepsister clutched a broken fan. The other was quietly whispering to a wall, probably re-evaluating her life choices. And then, hooves. The front door burst open. The prince stepped through, half breathless, half disbelieving. He saw her, and this time he didn't walk. He didn't bow, he ran. Cinderella met him halfway, shoes clicking softly across the stone. They didn't kiss, not yet. That would have felt too easy. Instead, he took her hand, lifted it gently, and said, "Please tell me your name." And she did. Not all at once, but enough. "Cinderella," she said. "My mother named me Ella. The rest was added later." His smile was slow, like something unfolding after a long winter. "I like Ella." The steward, in the background, began coughing into his scroll. "Your Highness, shall we prepare for the announcement?" The prince didn't take his eyes off her. "Yes, let the kingdom know I've found her." The birds appeared again. Of course they did, this time carrying tiny crowns made of hazel twigs and velvet thread. And still, no one blinked. The wedding was planned in what felt like hours. There were feasts, of course. Tailors and florists and bakers worked through the night. One baker made a cake so large, 3 mice got stuck in it and now live there rent-free. True story. But Cinderella didn't care about the pomp. She barely noticed the endless fittings or flower arrangements. Her eyes were on the garden being built near the palace's west wing, where her hazel tree would soon be replanted. Because yes, she asked, she didn't want riches or titles or 20 gowns sewn with moonlight. She just wanted her tree. And to everyone's surprise, the prince said yes, not because he was whipped, though let's be honest, a little, but because he understood. That tree had raised her. The wedding day dawned bright and warm. A good omen, they said. People gathered from all corners of the kingdom. Some came for love, others for gossip. A few just wanted free food. Cinderella's dress was simple, compared to what people expected. No floating pearls or armoured sleeves, just soft silk and trailing threads of gold, and a neckline that made half the royal court take notes. Her hair was pulled back with fresh blooms, and she wore the golden slippers one last time. Yes, last time. We'll get to that. The ceremony was held beneath the newly replanted hazel tree, which, yes, blossomed mid-vow. Every dove in the forest showed up. One owl tried to officiate, which confused things briefly. They said their vows slowly, carefully, like promises made over firelight. And when it was done, when the crowd cheered and bells rang, and cake was flung by over-enthusiastic children, the prince leaned close and whispered, "You're still going to run sometimes, aren't you?" She smiled. "Only if you chase me." People still argue whether Cinderella ever truly became royal. She wore the title, yes, she played the parts when needed, but deep down, she never stopped being the girl who danced in secret, who spoke to birds, who knew that power doesn't come from crowns, it comes from knowing who you are when no one's watching. Now, about those slippers, she wore them through the wedding feast, through the first dance, through the hours of mingling with diplomats and dodging awkward conversations about succession law. But later, much later, when the palace had quieted and the moon hung high over the gardens, Cinderella walked back to the tree and took them off. She left them at the base of the trunk. No fanfare, no tears, just reverence. Magic, she knew, wasn't meant to be clung to. It was a gift for the moment, not forever. She stepped barefoot through the grass, the silk of her dress brushing the dew, and didn't flinch once. Her feet had known worse. The prince found her there. He sat beside her, jacket discarded, shirt wrinkled from too many congratulations. "You left them," he said, softly. She nodded. "You don't want to keep them?" "I don't need to." And that was it. A quiet, perfect ending. Or maybe the beginning. As for the stepmother and stepsisters, well, let's just say justice arrived in the most polite, poetic way possible. They were invited to the wedding, out of courtesy, not pettiness. Cinderella even greeted them with a grace that made several nobles raise eyebrows. She offered a soft, "Thank you for coming," and moved on. But afterward, the birds got involved. Not violently, don't worry. PG-13, remember. Just enough nips and shoves to send a clear message. Your reign is over. They weren't punished by decree, but they were forgotten. Slowly, steadily, like a rumour that never took hold. They faded from the court's interest, their ambitions wilted, and eventually they left the city. One became a goat farmer, the other married a poet who only spoke in riddles. The stepmother opened a tea shop no one ever visited, which honestly is kind of perfect. And Cinderella? She ruled with quiet strength, not loud, not flashy, but steady. She spoke for the voiceless. She protected forests and orphanages and old forgotten trees. She danced often, though rarely in ballrooms, and she never needed anyone to save her again. Because really, she never had. Happily ever after is a sweet idea. But it's also a little lazy, because real life keeps going. Even after the crown fits, the music fades, and the last cake crumb is swiped by a passing squirrel. Cinderella's life didn't suddenly freeze into a flawless portrait. It evolved, quietly, slowly, and with far more laundry than anyone ever warns you about in fairy tales. Let's start with the palace. It wasn't a cosy space, it was enormous. Too many rooms, too many servants who whispered about her in corners. Too many rules about how one must eat soup. Cinderella, who had grown up with ash in her eyelashes and soot in her lungs, found herself lost in velvet hallways that echoed like caves. The prince, now officially king-in-waiting, whatever that meant, did his best. He left little notes in her dressing mirror, took her on late-night walks through the rose garden when she felt overwhelmed. Once he even got into a public spat with the royal etiquette advisor over whether she should have to wear gloves to breakfast. She won. No gloves. Porridge tastes better with bare fingers, she insisted. But still, adjustment took time. People still argue whether the palace staff truly accepted her or just tolerated her, with tight smiles and whispered comparisons. She wasn't raised royal. She didn't have pedigree. She once burped in front of an archduke and followed it with, "Bless me, that was bold." It was glorious, one of her first royal decisions, opening the palace doors to children, orphaned, street-wandering, forgotten children. She started small, tea in the garden on Sundays, then tutoring, then beds, then homes. The old council balked. She didn't care. "You gave me a life," she told the prince. "Now I'll make one for others." He supported her fully, though he did once grumble, "I thought I was marrying a girl who loved birds, not one who turned the East Wing into a preschool." She threw a pillow at him. She also started spending more time in the woods, not running, not hiding, just remembering. She planted hazel trees across the kingdom, not because they were magical, but because they were hers. Every town square got one, even the dry, dusty ones where trees usually wilted. And sometimes, at dusk, she'd talk to them. No one thought it was strange, not anymore. She brought animals into the palace too, at first just mice and birds who had known her in the kitchen days. But word spread. Soon cats lounged on throne cushions, squirrels nested in the chandelier. One goose became so territorial over the royal fountain that guests learned to give it a wide berth. And through it all, Cinderella didn't pretend to be someone else. She didn't change her laugh, which snorted occasionally, didn't stop walking barefoot in spring, didn't adopt the stiff posture the Duchess tried to teach her. Back straight, chin noble, hands like doves. She just lived. The king eventually, ruled beside her, though she never let him forget their odd, twinkling beginning. "Remember when you tried to trap me with pitch? Bold strategy. Effective, wasn't it?" Romantic and sticky. Their love didn't burn like wildfire. It didn't sweep. It grew, like ivy on stone, quiet, determined, rooting into every crevice of shared life. They argued. They teased. They disagreed on wallpaper. She liked florals, he liked maps, but they always met in the middle. He made space for her voice. She made space for his silence. And they were happy, not every day, but enough. One of the more delightful moments came when Cinderella was asked to choose a royal crest, something to mark her reign. She chose a bird in flight carrying a slipper in its beak. People laughed. She didn't care. "If I'm going to be remembered," she said, "let it be for my escape." The crest stuck. She did make one major royal change. She outlawed forced foot fittings. It sounds silly, but after the slipper search, the craze had gotten out of hand. Parents were binding their daughters' feet. Shoemakers were bribed. One noblewoman nearly lost a toe trying to match the myth. Cinderella signed the decree herself. "No one should be forced to fit something not made for them," she said, "especially not for someone else's story." That line would later become inscribed above the royal library, which she helped redesign, by the way. She added whole wings for tales that had been buried, folk stories, kitchen table myths, lullabies no one had bothered to write down. She invited old storytellers in to speak them aloud, weaving memory into marble halls. The children loved it, and somewhere in all this, between the quiet love, the woodland walks, the candlelit councils and dandelion teas, Cinderella became more than just a queen. She became legend, but not the stiff, polished kind. She was the barefoot ruler, the soot sister who spoke to birds, the girl who danced through 3 nights and didn't break, who didn't wait to be saved, but made her own way out. And she never stopped tending to the tree. The hazel that grew outside the palace bloomed each spring. Not with gold, not with gowns, just leaves, just birds, just the whisper of branches in wind that remembered the girl who once knelt beneath them, lonely but unbroken. She visited often, sat under its shade with children or cats or diplomats who needed reminding that magic wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just endurance. The years, like soft rain, blurred edges and deepened roots. Time passed, not quickly, not harshly, but with the gentle relentlessness of seasons. Cinderella's reign blossomed alongside the land itself. The kingdom grew calmer, kinder. People began planting hazel trees in their yards, not because they believed wishes would flutter down, but because they liked what the trees symbolized. Quiet strength, second chances, and shoes that never needed to be worn twice. By the 10th year of her queenship, Cinderella was more beloved than ever, not just by ballads and bard songs, but by real people. Market vendors, gardeners, stable hands, little girls who asked if they too could become queens by being kind and smart and barefoot in winter. Her answer was always yes. But what people didn't know, not really, was that Cinderella never truly stopped watching the shadows. You see, she never forgot what it was like to be unseen, to be background noise in someone else's life, to be spoken over, sent away, told to shrink. So when whispers returned about distant provinces where girls were being denied schooling, where stepmothers treated orphaned nieces like unpaid labour, Cinderella didn't send messengers, she went herself, not in gowns, not with fanfare. She travelled disguised, a cloak, a mule, a satchel of dried fruit and 2 pears. People still argue whether it was risky for a queen to roam like that. But those who met her on those quiet journeys remember a woman who listened without writing anything down, who handed out dry socks and bread, and who once challenged a corrupt tax officer to a foot race. She won. Barefoot, obviously. These side quests, as the prince called them, became a tradition. Twice a year, Cinderella vanished from the palace for a week. The royal staff gave up panicking by year 3. They knew she'd come back, with stories, bruises, and a list of things that needed changing. She never did it for the applause. She did it because no one else had when she was young. Meanwhile, palace life adjusted to her rhythms. The royal calendar now included squirrel feeding hour and something called Moonlight Mondays, where all candles were extinguished and people were encouraged to sit in darkness and just think. At first the nobles hated it, but by the 5th Monday, even the Chancellor admitted his sleep had improved. The prince, forever a romantic realist, stood beside her through it all. His hair greyed at the temples, his eyes got wiser, and sometimes a little tired, but his laugh still came easily when she tossed her crown across the room after a dull council meeting. They never had children, not because they couldn't, just because they didn't need to. Their kingdom was their child. They raised it together, nurtured its odd corners, gave it room to fail and grow, and in return, the people gave them something rarer than loyalty. They gave them grace. They forgave when mistakes happened. They sent flowers during illnesses. Once, during a political scandal involving a shipment of cursed pumpkins, don't ask, the people staged a 3-day festival called Forgiveness Feast just to show their support. That's the kind of ruler Cinderella became. She didn't make people fear her. She made them see themselves in her. Now let's talk about the slippers one more time, because, surprise, the story wasn't quite over. One winter, during a snowstorm so heavy it turned the palace steps into marshmallow drifts, a young boy wandered into the throne room, holding a broken gold shoe. Not the slippers. A copy. "Found it in the attic," he said. "Says it belonged to someone brave." He was 7. Missing a front tooth. His hands were shaking from cold. Cinderella crouched beside him. "You know," she said, "I've never liked those shoes." He blinked. "But they're magic." They were. "But I'm better barefoot." He giggled, then sneezed violently into her sleeve. She didn't even flinch. Later that night, she and the prince sat by the fireplace, the broken replica between them. Snow tapped at the windows. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. "The magic?" She looked at him. At the man who had chased her 3 nights in a row, caught only a slipper, and still decided to find the girl. "No," she said, "but I still dream about the tree." He nodded. "Me too." They didn't talk much after that. Just held hands under the blanket, their fingers laced like woven threads. The next morning, Cinderella went out into the snow, alone. She stood beneath the hazel tree, now bare and sleeping under frost. Around its base, little paw prints crisscrossed, foxes, birds, mice, life still circling. She closed her eyes, not to wish, just to thank it. Because people forget, wishing isn't begging. Wishing is hoping with direction. And Cinderella had lived her life in that direction. From soot to silk, from silence to speeches, from locked rooms to open roads. She reached up, touched one frost-covered branch, and smiled. The birds didn't sing. The wind didn't shift. The magic was already inside her. Years blurred again. Not in a sad way, in a soft one. Like watching morning fog lift slowly over a quiet lake. Cinderella, now greying at the edges like a favourite book, began stepping back from official duties. Not retiring exactly, just sharing. The kingdom had grown strong, thoughtfully run. And when she looked around at the next generation of advisors, teachers, and young nobility, she didn't see vanity or greed. She saw curiosity, empathy, even mischief, all excellent ingredients for a future. So she handed over small things, one by one, the harvest councils, the spring planting festival, even the hazel tree tours, though she insisted on training the guides herself. The prince, still sharp, still fond of cake before dinner, was happy to slow down with her. They spent more time in the garden. Sometimes they snuck out of the palace just to wander the nearby markets. No disguises anymore. Just well-worn cloaks and familiar faces. The people didn't mob them, they waved. One child, seeing Cinderella buy a pear, whispered, "She's the barefoot queen," and the fruit vendor replied, "Yes, and she still haggles like a chimney sweep." She laughed so hard she dropped the pear. But age brings memory, and memory in turn asks to be shared. So she wrote, not scrolls or declarations, stories, her own of course, but also the ones she'd collected in kitchens and barns, behind market stalls and under bridges. She wrote of tailors who danced with ghosts, bakers who fed forests, sisters who ran instead of waiting, and always, always she circled back to choice. Because that's what had defined her. Not the slipper, not the dress, but the moment she stood in ashes and chose to go to the ball. And the moment after that, when she chose to leave it. And the one after that, when she chose not to be small anymore. People still argue whether the real magic was the fairy godmother. Some say it was the birds or the tree. But those who knew Cinderella best, who had seen her refuse to let pain turn into bitterness, knew the truth. The magic was always her. One morning, soft light, bird song, steam curling from tea, she sat beneath the hazel tree with her husband, wrapped in a shared blanket. They watched the leaves shift colours, golds, reds, a few stubborn greens. "Do you remember," she said, "the first time you saw me?" "I remember the way the world paused," he said. "Like the night itself was holding its breath," she smiled. "You're a terrible poet. And yet you married me." They sat in silence for a while, each thinking different thoughts shaped like the same memory. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the second slipper. Yes, she'd kept it, hidden, not out of sentiment but as a private reminder of what she'd overcome, of who she'd once been. "I think it's time to let this go," she said, placing it at the base of the tree. They watched as a small breeze lifted through the branches, stirring the leaves until one fell gently, just one, onto the slipper's curve. Then stillness. She didn't need to bury it, just leave it. By spring it was gone. No one knows where. Maybe the earth took it. Maybe a bird nested in it. Maybe it finally turned to gold and scattered like sunlight. No matter. She didn't need it anymore. Cinderella lived many more years. She saw girls born into the kingdom who knew her not as legend, but as the quiet old queen who hummed while watering basil. She saw boys who cried without shame and learned to sew. She saw kindness become law, not just suggestion. She saw her story become 100 new ones. And when finally her bones ached too much and her steps slowed to half the rhythm they once knew, she spent her last days in the garden. With her feet in the grass and a cat on her lap, she passed away in sleep. In spring, with doves perched on her windowsill and hazel branches stretching toward the sky, the people didn't mourn with black veils or wails of grief. They wore gold slippers, not on their feet, on their belts, their coats, their lapels, small pins, tiny emblems, not because of what she wore, but because of what she didn't need to wear forever, because she had walked away from magic and still stayed whole. The kingdom rang bells made of hazelwood, the children planted trees, and somewhere, beneath leaf and sky, something ancient whispered, "Well done, Ella, wind down 300 words." And now, dear dreamer, the stars have begun their quiet drift across the ceiling of night. The story is over, but like Cinderella's final steps through dewy grass, your own footsteps now ease towards stillness. Let the world outside your window fade. The worries, the noise, the should-haves, they can wait. Just for now, let them rest. Picture the garden, the hazel tree, its branches gently swaying, not in wind, but in memory. Golden light filters through the leaves, catching little flecks of magic that don't need to sparkle loudly to be real. Everything feels slower here, softer, like silk sliding off the shoulders of a long day. Let yourself breathe deeply, in and out. You are safe, you are held. And just like our girl, who once swept ashes with a dream, tucked behind her ear, you too carry quiet strength inside you. So nestle deeper into your blankets. Wiggle your toes just once, like a wave goodbye to the day. Feel the weight of your body soften into your bed. Let your mind sink, not sharply, but gently, like a boat sliding into still waters. You don't have to chase anything now. The story has been told. The slipper fits, the crown is just an accessory, and your place in the world doesn't depend on what others see. Close your eyes. The night is long and kind, and if you listen closely, you might still hear the rustle of hazel leaves, telling their own stories under the stars.